He forgave him once. He elevated him. He trusted him with everything. And on one single morning, that trust became the blade that killed him. This is the story of the friend who struck first. Welcome to the Judas Archives. Turn down the lights. Get comfortable. Tonight, we open another file from the archive. We are taught that betrayal comes from strangers, from rivals, from men who never loved us. But history's oldest lesson is this: the hand that holds the knife closest to your heart usually belongs to someone you called family. Tonight, we return to the marble halls of ancient Rome, a city built on conquest, ambition, and the constant, quiet threat of betrayal simmering just beneath its polished surface. We step inside its walls to dissect the anatomy of the most infamous act of treachery ever recorded, the day the mask finally fell from a senator named Marcus Junius Brutus, a man history would never let forget his own name. Julius Caesar was Rome's brightest and most terrifying star, a man who seemed to bend history around his own ambitions, a brilliant general, a shrewd politician, a man who had conquered Gaul, crossed the forbidden Rubicon in open defiance of the Senate, and returned home not as a criminal, but as a conqueror. The people adored beyond reason. But Caesar was not simply feared. To many, he was beloved. Generous with his enemies, quick to forgive, famous across the empire for pardoning the very men who had fought against him in brutal civil war, where other tyrants executed their rivals. Caesar embraced his, believing, perhaps naively, that mercy could accomplish what conquest never could: lasting loyalty. Among those forgiven enemies was a young senator named Marcus Junius Brutus, a man who had fought against Caesar in that very civil war, backing the losing side entirely. By every law of Rome, Caesar could have had him executed without question. Instead, he did something far more dangerous. He forgave him completely, and then he elevated him. Caesar embraced Brutus, promoted him, and some in Rome even whispered a darker, more intimate truth beneath the political one, that Brutus's own mother, Servilia, had once been Caesar's lover, and that the young senator walking beside him may have been more than a favored ally. He may, in the eyes of some, have been blood. Caesar appointed Brutus to the powerful position of praetor, one of Rome's highest judicial offices, and openly spoke of grooming him for even greater honors still to come. To the watching eyes of the outside world, Brutus was the golden son of Rome's new order, a rising star basking entirely in his mentor's reflected light. But inside the quiet, marble rooms of the Senate, far from public praise and golden titles, a colder machinery was already beginning to turn. Whispers moved from senator to senator in the shadows of the corridors, small and careful at first, testing the air before growing bolder, sharper, and far more dangerous. A faction of senators, led by the sharp, calculating mind of Gaius Cassius, grew increasingly convinced that Caesar intended to crown himself king, the one title Rome had violently outlawed for nearly 500 years since driving out its last tyrant. To them, Caesar's mercy wasn't kindness. It was the patient calm before an emperor's coronation. Cassius needed a name the public would trust completely to make an assassination look like liberation instead of murder. He needed a face untouched by personal ambition, someone whose reputation alone could convince an entire city that killing Caesar was virtue, not violence. He needed Brutus, and he knew precisely how to reach him. Cassius began a quiet, patient campaign of psychological pressure. Forged letters mysteriously appeared on Brutus's chair in the Senate, praising his ancestor who had once driven a tyrant king from Rome centuries earlier, and asking again and again why his celebrated bloodline had gone so silent now, when Rome needed it most. Night after night, Brutus sat alone with his conscience, wrestling with a question dressed up carefully as patriotism was loving Caesar, a man who had shown him nothing but mercy and trust, itself a quiet betrayal of Rome and everything it once stood for. The question wouldn't let him rest. Plutarch tells us Brutus barely slept at all in those final, agonizing weeks before the Ides. His wife, Portia, daughter of a fiercely principled statesman herself, noticed the hollow, haunted look behind his eyes and begged him, night after night, to finally confide in her whatever secret was quietly consuming him. Portia, desperate to prove she could carry the weight of whatever her husband was hiding, is said to have taken a small blade and wounded her own thigh in private, testing whether her silence could withstand real physical pain. Only after seeing this did Brutus finally confide in her the terrifying truth he could no longer carry entirely alone. He admitted his torment wasn't born from hunger for power or personal gain, but from a belief, twisted slowly by cold philosophical logic, that killing the man he genuinely loved was the only noble path left to save a republic he feared was already slipping away beneath Caesar's growing shadow. By the Ides of March, more than 60 senators had joined the conspiracy entirely. Each man agreed to strike, so that no single blade and no single name would carry the full, unbearable weight of the murder alone. The plan was cold, mathematical, and deliberately designed so guilt could be divided into pieces too small for any one conscience to hold. The plan was mathematical in its cruelty, engineered so that responsibility would scatter across 60 hands instead of settling onto one. If everyone struck, they reasoned, then no one man alone would carry Caesar's blood. It was a conspiracy built not on courage, but on the architecture of shared, distributed guilt. That morning, Caesar was warned, more than once. A soothsayer had told him weeks earlier to beware the Ides of March specifically. A trusted friend pressed a scroll directly into his hand, naming the conspirators one by one. Caesar, ever confident in the loyalty surrounding him, simply tucked the warning away. Caesar, ever confident in the unwavering loyalty of the men around him, a confidence built on decades of mercy freely given, tucked the warning scroll away completely unread and walked calmly toward the Senate, believing, as he always had, that trust given generously would always be returned in kind. He walked alone into the one room in all of Rome he believed could never truly harm him, the very institution he had spent years reforming, funding, and defending. The Senate steps stretched endlessly before him that morning, marble worn smooth by centuries of footsteps, far less consequential than his own. Inside the Senate, the conspirators surrounded Caesar swiftly, under the pretense of a formal petition, a request for a banished brother's return. One senator seized his toga forcefully, pulling it down from his shoulders. It was the signal, the single, silent gesture that finally set 60 blades into motion. The first blade struck from behind, sudden and shallow, more shock than mortal wound. Caesar spun immediately, genuinely stunned, fighting back with everything he had, against men he had personally pardoned, promoted, and called friend. For one terrible moment, betrayal and disbelief looked exactly the same on his face. And then, through the chaos of grasping hands and gleaming steel, Caesar finally saw him. Brutus, the boy he had forgiven completely, the man he had elevated above nearly all others, stepping forward now, with a blade of his own, drawn and ready, his expression unreadable in the dim Senate light. Ancient historians say, Caesar stopped fighting entirely the instant he recognized that face among his attackers. Some accounts claim his final words weren't the famous Latin cry of popular legend, but a quiet, utterly broken Greek phrase instead, whispered directly to the one man he never expected to see there. You too, child. The cold, careful logic Brutus had spent months constructing had completely devoured whatever warmth once existed between them. In that single frozen moment, philosophy and friendship collided violently, and philosophy, cruelly, was the one left standing over the body of the man who had trusted it least. Caesar finally fell, at the base of a statue of his old rival Pompey, an irony historians still find difficult to ignore, stabbed 23 separate times by men who insisted, right up to the end, that they loved Rome more than they feared the weight of their own conscience. Only one single wound, out of 23, was actually fatal. The rest were simply proof of exactly how many trembling hands had needed to strike, needed to share the unbearable weight of a betrayal none of them could carry entirely alone, even divided 60 ways. The conspirators expected cheering crowds afterward, grateful citizens hailing them openly as liberators who had freed Rome from a tyrant's grip. Instead, they were met with stunned, horrified silence. Rome did not see heroes standing before them. It saw 60 men who had murdered a friend mid-sentence. In the days that followed, Brutus tried to address the Roman people directly, expecting his carefully rehearsed, noble justification to hold firm under public scrutiny. It didn't. The philosophy that had felt so clean and righteous in private now sounded entirely hollow, spoken aloud over a dead man's body. The philosophy that had seemed so morally clear, in quiet, candle-lit rooms, now sounded hollow and thin, spoken aloud in daylight, over a body still cooling on marble stones. The logic of his cause could not undo what his own trembling hand had already irreversibly done. Mark Antony, Caesar's closest ally, delivered a funeral oration that turned the entire city against the conspirators. Within hours, he held up Caesar's bloodied, torn toga for the grieving crowd to see clearly, listing each of the 23 stab wounds aloud, one devastating name at a time. What had been carefully framed as noble sacrifice now looked exactly like what it truly was, an ambush dressed in senatorial robes. The city of Rome turned violently, furiously against the conspirators, almost overnight, hunting through torchlit streets for the men who had called themselves liberators. Brutus and Cassius fled Rome entirely, raising desperate armies, in a last attempt to defend a republic that, as it turned out, no longer wanted their particular brand of protection. The Rome they claimed to have saved had already turned its back on them completely. Two long years later, at the brutal Battle of Philippi, their forces were finally crushed by the combined armies of Mark Antony and Caesar's young adopted heir, Octavian. The war fought supposedly to save the Republic ended instead in its final, bloody collapse on a foreign battlefield. Faced with capture and certain public humiliation, both men chose instead to fall on their own swords rather than be paraded in chains through the very streets of the city they had once claimed, so desperately, to be saving from tyranny. The Republic Brutus died believing he had protected, did not survive him for long. Caesar's adopted heir, young Octavian, used the chaos left behind by the assassination to seize total power completely, becoming Rome's first emperor and ending the Republic forever. Every fear that had driven the conspirators to murder their friend came true regardless. They had only guaranteed it happened faster and bloodier than it might have otherwise. If you are sitting in the quiet tonight, replaying a friendship that ended in a blade you never saw coming, remember, even the most noble excuse cannot undo the wound of a trusted hand turned against you. The mind can always find a reason to justify the unforgivable. The heart never forgets the shape of the knife that held it. Thank you for spending another night in the archives. If this story brought you comfort, leave a broken heart emoji below and subscribe to join our quiet community. The archive is closing for now. See you next time. When the next dark stories unfold, you are not alone. Goodbye.